Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Howdy friends and elite achievers, welcome to a brand new episode of the Modern Leadership Podcast. How many of you are country music fans? I went through a phase, listened to a bunch. About 10 years ago, this guy named Brad Paisley had a hit song called Welcome to the Future. Throughout the song, he gives examples on how great the present is when you compare it to the past. Things like TVs on long road trips or having video games inside the home and the global video chat. I wonder what he would sing about today. Driverless cars, Airbnb, Netflix, podcasting, who knows? Innovation has done amazing things. But guess what? The rate of technological progress hasn't slowed. Our future continues to change daily, and that is why I'm so excited to introduce you to today's guest, Alex Salkever. Alex is an author, a speaker, and a futurist. First off, how cool is that? I want futurist on my business cards. Alex has been a senior executive at a number of Silicon Valley startups and technology companies, including Mozilla and Telefonica. He's also been the technology editor of BusinessWeek and dozens of other major publications. He is co-author of The Immigrant Exodus, Why America is Losing the Global Race to Capture Entrepreneurial Talent, which, by the way, was named by The Economist to the Books of the Year list 2012. More recently, he co-authored The Driver in the Driverless Car, How Our Technology Choices Will Create the Future, which was named to a list of finalists for the Financial Times McKinsey Book of the Year Award. Alex, it is so great to have you joining us today. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me on, Jake. I'm great. We have wonderful weather where I am in California, and I'm enjoying a late afternoon here.
Well, that is awesome. We've talked in the intro about this futurist concept, and I can't wait to get into that. But I got to ask you, how does it feel to have your books on these prestigious lists, Books of the Year and McKinsey and Financial Times? I mean, that's got to be a little surreal.
It's kind of pinch yourself, to be honest. When you grow up, you see people writing and you see these books in bookstores and you read about these competitions and awards. And then it happens to you and you're just kind of like, wait, that's not really happening, is it?
Did you know from the beginning that you wanted to write? I mean, is writing in your blood a little bit?
I would guess so, yes. So my father is an academic and my mother ran nonprofits. I grew up reading books quite a bit. My parents would take me to the library pretty much every weekend, and I'd stagger out with a stack of 15 books or so. My father also, because he's an economist, he would subscribe to publications like the New Republic, the Public Good, fairly sophisticated academic journals, and I'd read them while I was sitting around the house. I was reading the New York Times when I was a little kid, when I was 8, 9 years old on Sundays. And from that, I just absorbed so much writing, loved magazines, loved it. When I got into university, I went to a wonderful university, University of California, Santa Barbara, and we had a spectacularly chaotic and fun student-run newspaper with truly no adult supervision. And that's where I started to do a lot more writing and really loved it the whole time.
Well, that's interesting. A direction I wasn't planning to go, but since it's kind of come up in my mind, as you look at young people today and the impact of reading on them and exposing them to different things, you talked about the publications of the New York Times and, being at the library and 15 books in a pile every week. Do you think that that's an important thing that as parents, as leaders, that we need to be encouraging the younger generation? Or should we have them more focus on like one task or one specific learning environment? Does that make sense?
It does, yes. So I'm a huge advocate of books and reading in all formats. I will never tell a kid it's bad to read on a Kindle or on their computer. That being said, I really prefer the print environment. I think it's better for our engagement and our absorption. I have some really strong concerns about electronic intermediation in the reading process. And frankly, kids are reading a lot less than they used to. Now, if you look at it in a different answer to your question, is it okay to be doing 17 different things at once while you're reading? Absolutely. A lot of research has gone into whether people should monotask or multitask. And in certain types of environments, multitasking makes a whole lot more sense. But like reading, you see people bop around quite a bit. They may have 4 different books on their bedside stand they're reading at any given time, and they may read them at different paces. To me, it's much more the length of the engagement and the ability to focus everything you have in that moment, as opposed to going from start to finish in one book or one newspaper or things like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I wanted to ask you 2 follow-up questions on that. The one being this multitask idea, because I would agree with you that doing things like listening to a podcast and going jogging, or listening to a podcast or watching a television show and doing the dishes is a good idea, multitasking in that definition. But let me ask you about multitasking when you're at work. For example, you're on a webinar, or you're on a training, a corporate training, and you're checking your email, or you're in a meeting, a live meeting, and you're back in the back, hunched over your BlackBerry in the BlackBerry prayer. And so I think I wanted to ask you about your definition of this multitasking and how we can decipher when it's good and when it's not good. Or do you think that it's actually becoming a new thing, that it's good in many cases?
So I actually think in general it's terrible. And even in the context that I'm talking about, switching from book to book, I'm not talking about switching from task to task in short order. I'm talking about reading one book for 2 hours one day, then maybe another book for 2 hours the next day. It's very different than being in a meeting and supposed to be listening to someone talking while you're checking your email and checking your social feeds. That type of multitasking, I think, is really not helpful at all in so many ways. It frustrates your colleagues because if someone took the time to present a webinar, you're not giving them respect by listening to them. It inevitably ends up in a sort of fractured attention span, which can mean even if you're sending emails, you're probably not sending them with a full mindset. And it may be the conversations that come out of them aren't that meaningful. You probably won't actually remember a lot of what transpires. So I think that type of fragmentation of the workday is one of the reasons why people feel often so stressed out and frustrated at work. And I'm a fan. I wasn't going to mention this until the end, but it's one of the books I've thought quite about. Is a book by a computer scientist named Cal Newport called Deep Work.
Yes.
You may have heard of it.
Of course, yes.
And I'm a big fan of what he advocates, which is that create space for different tasks. So if you're going to email, batch them, or do that on the hour. But if you're in a meeting, listen to the meeting. Shut your laptop. Don't spend time flipping from task to task. And likewise, if you're reading a book, sit and read your book. Don't read your book while the television's on. I mean, doing a podcast while you do the dishes, yeah, maybe that's okay, but I wouldn't count that as a sort of a highly educational learning experience, and you probably won't remember quite as much.
Yeah, and by the way, the Deep Work book is a Modern Leadership Book Club book coming up in 2018 that we're going to deep dive into as a group here. And so glad that you brought that up, because one of the things he talks about is how he gets more done in 2 hours a day than most of the world gets done in the entire day. But I want to shift gears a little bit here, Alex, and I want to go into a couple of different things. One is you are a futurist. It says so right in your bio, and I want that in my bio. So what is a futurist, and what do we need to do to get there?
So I actually picked that title for myself in the bio, to be honest. I think anyone can call themselves a futurist. The reason that I put it in my bio and feel that I've gotten to that place to a degree is that you really want to spend a lot of conscious time looking at what's happening, where trends are moving, and be able to write cogently about it and have a thesis about it. And I think that's what defines people as a futurist. Most futurists are going to be wrong. I mean, the predictions are almost always wrong. That's just the nature of the beast. So I see much more the idea of being a futurist as trying to inform people about what's coming down the pike, what technologies they should think about, and how to be aware of them before they become mainstream. Not trying to say, oh, in 2015, we're going to have this or that, that type of prediction markets. But I think anybody can be a futurist if they want to spend a good amount of time reading about new technology developments, reading some more thoughtful pieces about where the world is going in different fields across genomics, robotics, artificial intelligence. It's really something that can be self-taught and should be self-taught, because frankly, I think all of us, we really owe it to ourselves in society to have a better understanding of what's going to happen, or at least of the technologies that are moving across. If you look at what's happened to our data and our privacy as an example, that's one that we let get away. We didn't really try to think hard about that. There hasn't been a lot of real social initiative to make that a human right or make that something that we control more finely. And so that's why you have situations like credit reporting agencies that collect all our data without us knowing about it, without us asking about it, and then try to sell it back to us.
That's an interesting topic. And before we go further down that road, I want to jump back and say, when I hear futurist and what I hear you saying, it reminds me of this obscure television show that many people have probably not heard of called Psych. And in this television show, you have the main character who grew up as the son of a police officer, and his father taught him to be observant. And now, fast forward to the present day, he's a psychic detective. Actually, he's just pretending to be one because all he does is observe what's around him and make judgments and predictions based on that. And as I hear you talk about being a futurist, and we can all be futurists, what you're saying is, be observant to what's around us. Study what we have, the books, the information, the webinars, the topics that are around us. Be familiar with those. And from there, you can start to make conclusions about what's going to happen or what we think is going to happen, which puts us in a direction. And I look, Alex, at what we're doing right now. You and I, we're sitting hundreds of miles apart. We're on Skype. We're communicating between the microphones here, something that 10, 20 years ago, I would have had to fly out and sit in your living room to have this conversation. We couldn't have predicted this would happen, but you could see some of the evidence is coming. And so I love your definition of a futurist. And at this point, Alex, I'd like to talk about a couple of these books. And I want to take you back to your 2012 book because the title absolutely captivated me, and that is The Immigrant Exodus. So can you talk to us a little bit about what this Immigrant Exodus is and why it's affecting our ability to capture entrepreneurial talent, especially in the Bay Area?
So the reason that book came about was actually the research of my co-author and good friend Vivek Wadhwa. He's a two-time entrepreneur himself, including one company that he took public. And he has worked with the Kauffman Foundation and other foundations that support entrepreneurship to try to understand what makes a good entrepreneur, who is becoming an entrepreneur. And one of the areas he focused on quite a bit was immigrant entrepreneurs and trying to understand them better. And so he started to do some research on who was the typical founder at Silicon Valley. And we found that a really disproportionate percentage of them were first-generation immigrants or children of first-generation immigrants. And you look kind of across the spectrum and you see evidence of this. Sergey Brin at Google, many of the people who founded the hardware startups in the Valley, Andy Grove at Intel was a first-generation immigrant. His parents were immigrants. And so like across, you'd find this very common thing that, people who came from that background tended to start companies at higher rates and tended to succeed at higher rates. The reason we ended up with the Immigrant Exodus is because as we were talking to more of these people, we started to realize that the U.S. had become a less hospitable place for many of these entrepreneurs who wanted to start companies. Many of them were struggling with visa problems. Some of them had come in on H-1B visas that made it very difficult for them to go off on their own and launch a company because you can't just switch out of an H-1B, it's a type of visa, and go start your company. In other areas, just basic things like hassles getting in and out of the country due to immigration status. Or even people from Europe having to leave the country every 90 days to renew a visa. And if you make any single violation along the way that gets caught for any reason, then it becomes much harder for you to enter this country on a visa that allows you to start a business. So we were essentially scaring away many of the greatest risk takers, many of the people that we wanted to come here. Now, I wouldn't say that the U.S. scared all of them off. I think a good chunk of them didn't come. Some of them stayed in India. Many of them went to China. A good amount went to Canada, which is incredibly welcoming to immigrants. And it's not like the U.S. is, say, worse than certain countries in the world that have extremely stringent environments on employment, which make it hard for people to grow startups or hire people and fire them. But you do see situations like Singapore really gaining a lot of ground in entrepreneurial attraction.
And so this book was written in 2012, which, as we talk about being a futurist, this is really a hot topic today I mean, we're talking about immigration today a lot. And this was written, a number of years before that. I want to ask you just a little bit about why we see these first generation immigrants or direct immigrants that come into the country and have this entrepreneurial success. What is it about that makes them a disproportionately higher number of successful entrepreneurs coming through immigrant status?
It's a really good question. And there hasn't been a great answer that's been put together because that's one of those qualitative or causative issues. We can look at correlations, but looking at true causes is, particularly for complex questions like that, is really difficult. What we suspect is that because of where they come from or where their parents came from, they fear failure less. They're more willing to take big risks. They also recognize that if their business fails, at least in the US, it's not that big a deal. It's terrible, but it's not going to ruin your life. They also are perhaps less likely to be able to go and get middle management jobs that pay very well, or to break into professions that are white collar and high paying. So going and starting companies may be the way that they deal with this. So we're not entirely sure, but we think a lot of it has to do with risk appetite.
And there's a brand new book that just came out that you might find interesting called The Immigrant Edge, spelled with an E, How to Make It Big in America. And the author is Brian Buffini, and he talks about some of these topics about, the less of a fear of failure and more of an opportunity to progress if a startup fails or moves on. And that's why I kind of wanted to bring this up and get your thoughts on it, because I would agree that there is entrepreneurial talent across the globe. And Alex, we just recently returned from a year-long trip where we spent 11 months in 12 countries. And while we were away, we saw entrepreneurial talent in all circumstances, from the wealth of London and Paris to the poverty of Myanmar and Cambodia. There are leaders and entrepreneurs everywhere. And so I'd love to get to the bottom of that. But before we do that, and before we run out of time, I'd love to talk about your newest book now, and that is The Driver in Driverless Cars, How Our Technology Choices Create Our Future. And so can you give me a background of how you got this idea and then kind of the context of this book?
Sure, no problem. And I'm glad that you brought this one up too, because it was a very different book than The Immigrant Exodus. Where this book came from was Vivek and I, we live in the Bay Area, as you used to, and we noticed that many of the people that we were close with in technology felt as if technology was controlling them or moving so quickly that it was hard to keep up. And you've seen some of this discussed by folks like Ray Kurzweil, exponential curves, but it really started to feel like that was true over the last 5 to 6 years. And nothing epitomized that more than the driverless cars. I don't know if you sort of noticed this or if you felt this way, but it almost felt like it came out of nowhere. Whereas, that's driverless cars, 20, 30 years, it'll come. Then bam, in 3 years, it goes from Google cars driving around Mountain View to potentially having these things up and running. Actually, in Phoenix, Arizona, I believe there's a taxi service that's supposed to launch.
Yeah, Uber's actually doing it out here, where you can specifically request an Uber that is driverless. I mean, there's a driver sitting there to catch things if something goes wrong, but for most of the time, it's just driving on its own.
Exactly. Whereas, 5 years ago, would you have thought this would be possible? So we thought that was an interesting metaphor to look at all sorts of technologies that are progressing faster and faster and that will have really big impact on our lives. The reason we picked the title, The Driver in the Driverless Car, is that what's the purpose of a driver in a driverless car? To a certain degree, there almost isn't one because the car is driving by itself. And if you look at the cover of the book, you'd see that the driver is actually pointing backwards in the driverless car, as if they really don't know what's happening or can't control it. But at the very bottom of this as well, too, and part of what we talk about in the book, we have to be drivers in our driverless cars, because if we aren't, then we will not control the society that develops from technology developing on its own.
And as I think about this, I thought the driver in the driverless car a little differently. I looked at it as what is pushing us towards this innovation? What's pushing technology, and how those that push is affecting our future. And so as you look, you didn't just write about the driverless car, you wrote about other technologies and other things that you're seeing. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of what you're seeing or what technology choices we're seeing in the future?
Absolutely. And that's really the theme of the book. I mean, the second part of the title is how our technology choices can change the future. So one thing that we look at in the book a bit is genomics and a newer technology called CRISPR, which you've probably read a little bit about. You may have interviewed someone on that topic. CRISPR makes it incredibly easy to edit genetic material, almost as easy as cutting and pasting words in a word processor. Now, that doesn't mean that we still fully understand how all of the genes interact, and we can immediately say, okay, we're going to make you smarter, or we're going to make your babies faster or better looking. But it does raise lots of interesting questions for the future about how we can ethically manipulate our genes. And so we have some frameworks around this now. There's some laws. But as this technology gets easier and easier to use, and also as the cost of sequencing genes drops further and further, so even at this point, it's probably between $100, $200 to sequence a human genome right now, then we start to run into lots of questions that we as citizens and as a society need to think about in how can we ethically and responsibly use genetic material in different circumstances. You know, for example, already there are bans on looking at genetic material or genetic information when rating health insurance policies. And that's probably a good law because it's not a really fair thing to rate someone because of what they're born with. But in the not so distant future, we probably will be able to start using CRISPR or other technologies to, for example, select or alter embryos, potentially to avoid really horrific diseases for children, but also potentially to try to give our children a better chance of being taller, smarter, or better looking.
And doesn't that make for an interesting kind of debate looking forward? Is you've got these benefits, but you've also got these risks. And Alex, I think this comes full circle with how we started this conversation when you were talking about the credit reporting agencies and kind of the monopoly that they have on the information and the mass amounts of information. And I think the cause of that was technology was advancing at such a pace that some of the regulatory bodies couldn't oversee it fast enough. And I think we're heading into a similar situation with what you're talking about here, where technology is moving so quickly that these regulators can't properly come up with the right, because we don't want to be regulated out of our ability to innovate. We don't want to be regulated to the point where we're just controlled, where we become, Fahrenheit 451. But this opens up this interesting debate. And so as you look towards the future, Alex, how do we as a society manage this debate? How do we look at both sides of the equation and come up with the right regulation for it?
It's a really good question and a really hard question.
That's the only questions we like on this podcast.
Good. In many instances, we've been heartened to see the type of deep debate that's happening around these topics, and that the powers that be and the researchers and the scientists take it seriously enough to really make a good effort at it. So, for example, in driverless cars, there's a fairly deliberate approach to it. I'm not saying it's perfect, and some people would say they're moving along very quickly. But on the other hand, most of the laws that we see coming around do still mandate that this is a go slow approach. And there's a lot of thoughts right now among, say, insurance commissioners on how do we deal with the insurance implications of this. Should the car makers have to carry insurance? Or when you look at CRISPR and genomics, researchers around the world are regularly meeting to think about, okay, how do we self-regulate? Until not so recently, there was a ban on using CRISPR to edit the genetic material of embryos, of human embryos. That was lifted after scientists felt that the technology was mature enough and the safeguards were strong enough that it could be done. Now, at another level, though, some of these technologies are really not being examined or regulated in any great way. And in that, for example, artificial intelligence, we really aren't putting as much effort into building security systems so that should artificial intelligence elements get out of control, we would be able to lock them down or stop them.
Do you think that's because this is still appears kind of science fiction-y? We're not there yet. We're not going to worry about artificial intelligence because this is something that Hollywood has handled. It's not going to be a reality. I mean, do you think that's why we haven't taken a look at it yet?
Actually, not so much. So the other two industries I was talking about, cars, genomics, and medicine, they have long histories of regulation, collaboration, working with government. Whereas a lot of technology, in artificial intelligence, which is more software algorithms, the approach has been a little more Uber-like, which is we're just going to build it and see what happens. And it's not something that's quite as easy to regulate. And to that point, you don't want to regulate software creation, like you said, because that would shut down innovation. So I think that there's a lot of opacity and lack of transparency in what's being done in the areas, and not so much real opportunity for debate or consideration of what happens if systems start to go wrong, if things start to break, or if biases get baked in deeply that impact some people in our society more than others. And you already see some of that. Redlining, which was a policy of making people, African Americans or people in poor zip codes, pay higher insurance rates for no good reason. That was institutional, and a lot of the biases that we start to see that humans carry are carried over into algorithms that the humans write.
Yeah, and I see that as a real problem moving forward is if we start with this foundation that's flawed a little bit and it gets baked in, then it's hard to change down the road. Then we have to have great uprisings and revolutions to get it changed as opposed to kind of controlling it and sending it down the right track in the very beginning. Alex, I think this conversation is absolutely fascinating. I love having it with you. Our time is running short. And before I let you go, I'd love to get a few answers to what we call learning from leaders, put a little personal with this business conversation that we've had. Are you ready to talk learning from leaders?
Absolutely.
All right. So our first question then is the book currently on your bedside table or Kindle?
So it's on my living room table, actually. I don't read in the bedroom quite as much. I read in the living room with a nice light. Actually, I prefer not to use LED light bulbs. I use regular old light bulbs. But it's by a former Google data engineer or data scientist named Seth Stevens-Davidowitz, and it's called Everybody Lies.
And what do you think? Do you recommend it to our listeners?
I recommend it highly to our listeners because what it's really good at doing is showing us that what we say and what we do when we're online, behaviors that we exhibit, things we search for, are often extremely different, and that in many, many ways, people are not what we say we are. For example, racism is probably very different when you look at it through the lens of what people are Googling for than what people say in polls. This digital element can give us a microscope a window into our souls, and that's what he writes about.
And I think it's a little bit scary because you're absolutely right. We act differently when we're under the public eye than we do when we're on our own. And some of those habits that we have when we're by ourselves are things that, we probably need to change. So I appreciate that book recommendation. How about the best movie ever made?
The best movie ever made. I'd have to say my favorite was the original Blade Runner, to be honest.
Have you seen the new one then?
I have not. I'm going to go see that one. I've heard it's tremendous, and I'm very excited to go see it.
Yeah, I've just seen the trailer myself, and the special effects are amazing. But Blade Runner, the original, best movie ever made. Great. How about your leadership superpower?
My leadership superpower is, I would say, ability to write and take very complex thoughts and concepts and communicate them in crisp writing form.
And that's so important for someone who deals in technology and writing about kind of the future and tech and innovation, to distill it down to what the rest of us can understand. So important. How about your favorite motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra?
So actually, this one I give credit to one of my kids for, and who is an avid young sports player. And whenever it's getting late and I'm tired and I say, let's go in, he says, Dad, you know what I say? Never too late, never too dark.
Oh, I love it. How about your best business book ever written?
I actually am not a huge fan of most business books. I find often that the level of evidence in them doesn't meet my standards. Often the sample sets are very small. Maybe it's somewhat anecdotal. So I really bias more towards books by scientists. One of your former guests, Anders Ericsson, I loved his book, Peak. And I'd say, though, my favorite, though, in recent memory is Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman. It really taught me a whole lot about happiness, how we all think as human beings, and how our brains work, and how that plays out in the real world in the way that we talk to each other and behave.
And the reason that this question made it onto the podcast and why I ask every guest on the show this specific question is because I agree with what you're saying. There are so many business books out there. If you go to Amazon, you could spend all day scrolling through books that call themselves business books, but they're not well researched, they're not well developed, and they don't really speak to me, and I don't think they speak to our audience. And that's why we always ask this question, because we want to get recommendations of things that people have read that have made a difference in their lives, not just something they heard about or their friend wrote, because publishing today is easier than ever. And so a lot of not good stuff is getting out there. Alex, before we let you go today, thank you so much for your time. How can we learn more about you? And of course, any last bit of advice you have for the listeners?
So you can learn more about me on my website, alexsalkever.com. I also publish in a bunch of places, Inc.com, Fortune. I publish sometimes on LinkedIn. You can follow me on Twitter if you want. And my advice for everybody would be stay as curious as possible, read as much as you possibly can, and make sure that you have at least an hour every day to do something that you really love to do without interruption.
And so our challenge to the Modern Leadership listener is to go out and spend an hour a day doing something you love. And hopefully that includes a little bit of staying curious and reading. Alex, I love this concept of being a futurist, of looking what's coming towards us through innovation and technological point of views. Thank you for spending a little bit of time with the Modern Leadership audience. We can't thank you enough.
Thank you for having me on, Jake. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right, guys, what did you think about Alex Salkever? Great guest on the show. I just love this topic of thinking about the future. After we hung up, as far as turned off the recording, we continued to talk, and we spent another 15 minutes just talking about his new book and some of the things that he's looking at, some of the things he sees in Silicon Valley. Very fascinating conversation. And one of the things I told him is, Alex, we got to have you back on this show because we need to talk about some of these things you have coming up in the future. This new book that kind of looks at the Maslowian needs, the 5 hierarchy of needs, and then what happens after those are met and how technology and the digital revolution is playing into that and affecting our futures. So love this conversation with Alex. A couple of my key takeaways as we look at this episode. I want to talk about being a futurist. And being a futurist is really all about being informed. It's about paying attention to what's going on around you and making observations and deductions from what you're seeing. And playing that into the future, you're going to be able to kind of get an idea, at least the trajectory that some of this technology, some of these opportunities are going. You can see things happening before they happen. And I'll give you a quick example. If you're paying attention to the economy and you're paying attention to the housing market and you're saying something doesn't feel right back in 2007, 2006, you would have seen the recession coming. But if we turn a blind eye and we don't pay attention to what's happening around us, well, then like a lot of us, you just get hit as the economy crashes and it takes an even bigger dive than it was necessary because we weren't paying attention. So let's challenge ourselves to be futurists by paying attention to some of the things that are changing and some of the things that are out there and really look at the opportunities that are coming down the pike for us. The second thing that I wanted to pull out specifically from this episode is the driver in the driverless car. Technology is offering choices for us, and we're going to have to make choices about how those play out in our lives. Are we going to accept them into our family? Are we going to accept them into our community, into our states, into our country? How are we going to regulate what's moving forward? And it really starts with us being informed and knowing what we want. Going after the things that are important to us, making a choice. Who is the driver in the driverless car? It's you and it's me. We are the ones driving this technology change, and we're the ones that are going to have to police it moving forward in the future. We're the ones who are going to have to make sure that it's being done in an ethical and moral way. So fascinating conversation with Alex. Of course, everything that we talked about, his books, his movie, and some of the major pullouts and quotes from this episode can all be found on jakeacarlson.com/ML48, episode 48. This is the last episode of 2017. So excited for 2018. It is going to be the best year ever. I'm going to make that promise to you right now. I have so much high hopes and expectations for 2018. We are going to hit the year running, whether you're listening to this on December 28th when it comes out, or you're listening to it in January after the new year. I want to wish you a safe and prosperous new year. Set those goals. Make a determination that this will be your best year ever, because I want to wish you a great day, an even better life. Make the best year out of 2018 by staying awesome. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.